If you're interested in getting to grips with some deeper ideas in your reading of literature, then you might just love this video, because here we're going to be discussing the pitfalls and dangers of literary theory and some of the problems it can lead to. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? In a video I made about a month ago, I discussed literary theory made simple, where I give an overview of some of the dominant literary theories and what they're supposed to give us when studying literature. Fundamentally, they are lenses or filters through which to see a text, and they can sometimes bring out some extraordinary insights and observations about the human condition and the way society works, which are really relevant, because all fiction, when written with purpose, is about humanity. And there are various things that can be drawn out. There are various influences that are on an author in any particular age, with any particular education, which we can sometimes draw out either as an intellectual exercise or research for a particular aspect of society or the human condition. And that's where theory can be great. It can give brilliant insights. But I did say in that video that if people wanted me to, I would do a video on why I think, or where I think, there are significant problems with literary theory. And because so many responded, here is that video. So I want to first start with an example of how literary theory can really shed some great light and be quite refreshing and stimulating. So I was recently reading a piece of theory, an essay on Great Expectations, seen through the lens of Darwinian theory. And of course, you may initially roll your eyes and think, oh, good grief, Dickens wasn't talking about Darwin in Great Expectations. But hang with this. There were some good reasons for the essay, and it was very enlightening. For instance, Great Expectations, as it was pointed out, was written in the same year that Origin of Species was released. Dickens had a copy of Origin of Species in his library. Dickens read it in the first year. Dickens was friends with Owen Wilson, who was head of the Natural History Museum, a vocal opponent of Darwin's theory. And so our essayist decided to look at how perhaps the Darwinian theory had impacted in this book. And going at it with a framework and a particular lens to see the text, some remarkable observations were brought out. For instance, up to this point, Dickens' characters are always influenced by their parent, hereditary effects. So Oliver Twist turns out to be a lovely lad in the end, because we find out his mum was a lovely upper middle class woman, and so he was innately good. He wasn't from the vicious poor. And this is something that recurs in Dickens' books, which interestingly I never really paid attention to. When he mentioned it, I thought, oh yeah, how interesting. In Great Expectations, this role is turned upside down. Has Dickens read Darwin's theory of evolution and thought, oh, this gives us a different way to look at things? Because he decouples the hereditary from Pip in this, and from Estelle, interestingly. And we have, instead of Pip getting to his great expectations because there's something hidden in his past in some character who's high profile, and so he inherits being a gentleman, he actually gets it from a criminal. So his outgrowth is from criminality. And the essayist mentioned, was this influenced by Darwin's idea that we all come from lower species and ascend upwards? Really interesting, and the essay goes on for a lot more. However, it itself bumps into the odd clangor, in my opinion, where I really raised a quizzical eyebrow, so high that it passed my own hairline. But nonetheless, it highlighted the power and the usefulness of a theory of examining a text and how it can bring out things that may otherwise escape our attention. Having said that, I now want to look at where theory can go wrong. So theorists like we say, they approach a text with a framework to analyse, and it can bring out very good insights. But those insights can be pushed too far. In fact, theory is a tool, and it must be remembered, in my opinion, that it is a lens or a filter. It is not the actual text. It is an imposition of a thought or a particular zooming in on a detail. Imagine I've focused in on some butterfly, which I used the example in the last video. But imagine I focused in to one single atom. I could learn a lot about that atom or its interrelationship with some molecules just nearby. I could look at biochemical makeup of one of the cells of the antenna. But that itself is not the butterfly. Excuse me, there's someone just started up mowing their grass, so I do beg your pardon for the noise. I'll just take a break and come back. So the noise has calmed down now. You may still hear it faintly in the background. But as I was saying, imagine someone is studying a butterfly and they're looking at its aerodynamics or its biochemical composition of particular cells, or maybe it's certain genes that it has unique to other creatures. These are all interesting, but not one of them the butterfly makes. The butterfly is its own thing. Now, theory in literature can sometimes be the same as that. You can approach, the theorist will approach this book or piece of literature, and they may deliberately come at it with a Marxist interpretation to see what that brings out, or a feminist interpretation, or a deconstructive interpretation, or an environmental interpretation. And while these things can reveal maybe some insights for us, they are not the book itself. And this comes to the issue of the author's intent and the theorist's interpretation, and whether the theorist recognises their limitations. And this is where it goes wrong a bit. So whenever an author writes a book, they come to it with a certain emotional feeling about themselves. They come to it with maybe a certain observation, what we talk about as the authorial urge in my Patreon group. They've seen something in the world and they want to express their insight. And they use their words, their experiences, their way of thinking to talk with a future reader. And we get to interact with it. But the theorist can come along and they approach it deliberately with a specific way of viewing that story. And so you do not get from literary theory a holistic, necessarily true understanding of what the author was going for. Now, theory is very good as long as you recognize that. So if I were doing some historical research about the role of women in history, and so I went to some of the famous books and looked at it through a feminist lens, I could draw certain insights out, which I could place maybe in my research of history. But the problem is, theorists can often use literary theory as a crystal ball rather than a lens. Rather than remembering that you've imposed a filter to change the colours and hues of the message to extract something, sometimes they use it that over-obsessed with the intellectual pleasure it gives them, and they look at it as if it's giving an insight into the mind of the author and telling us the deep meanings. And that's why you sometimes get this issue with massive symbolism, which the author probably doesn't even think is there, but the theorist is convinced is there. And that also comes from the fact that we as readers can turn up with preconceived notions. And that's called imposing your experience on the book. And that's where theory sometimes goes a bit too far, when it goes from lens and filter to the crystal ball to your own personal ideologies. And that's where theory causes some issues, is it becomes a vehicle for ideology to tell people that the book must be interpreted in this way because the theorist themselves believes a certain idea. They believe in capitalism or they believe in socialism, so they interpret everything according to that. Then you have problems. So a good example of this, let's start with the great one himself, Hamlet by Shakespeare. Now, so much has been written about Hamlet using the psychoanalytical framework, specifically the Freudian one, and so you can reference that back in my other video. And that's why there's been a lot written about Hamlet's obsession with his mother, and the repression of sexual desire and feelings, the anger towards his mother, but also the lust towards her, and his sexual jealousy and feeling of sexual threat from his uncle who has married her. And do you really think Shakespeare thought that? Do you really think when Shakespeare put it together, he thought, oh, Hamlet, got a particular thing for his mum? Of course he hasn't, right? One of the weaknesses for me, one of the theories I like least is the Freudian psychoanalytical theory, because basically everything comes down to sex. And is that what Hamlet's about? Talk about missing the overriding message, the exploration of humanity. Now, there's nothing wrong with the theory maybe highlighting, because fiction is never totally fiction, by the way. It's always drawn from our experiences, so it's related to the real. We know how people act. So we could get some insights, but to take it down to just that would be to entirely miss the point of Hamlet. In fact, to ruin it completely. And that's where, if someone's going at Hamlet with a lens and they recognise this is merely a tool to extract one or two observations which may be of interest, fine. But if you push it to then explaining all of Hamlet through the id and the ego, you've lost the plot. And it's that often puts many people off literature. One of the dangers is it makes literature too elite. It makes it sound too complex. People read a book and they worry that they're not getting out of it what theorists get out of it. Normally, if you've read the book without the theory, you probably can get more than someone who is so entrenched in a theory that they interpret everything one way. They're the ones missing out. It's not just this book, Julius Caesar. There's interesting stuff been written about this and how it's, the feminist critique of this. There are only two female characters in Julius Caesar, Calpurnia and Portia. Calpurnia is Caesar's wife, and Portia, I believe, is Brutus' wife, yeah. And I've seen things written through that lens and how it's about the feminine entering the masculine, and it's about the loss of power through the feminizing of men and the benefits of the feminine traits, but can they equally coexist in a society? I hate to say it, but personally I think that's rubbish. Calpurnia is not a shrew, as some people say, as if that's the only Elizabethan interpretation, that a woman is a shrew if she's bossy. It's because Shakespeare knew there were powerful women in Rome, women who murdered their husbands, women who, engineered the rise of their children to power. And Calpurnia is a pretty, one to deal with. And so to interpret this in a feminist light, maybe you can extract one or two things, but it tends to go too far and focus all about, now let's look at the femininity within men, and is it their demise, and is Brutus breaking down over his wife's death, feminizing the man, that's why it all falls apart. No, it's human emotions. That's what Shakespeare was interested in. So there's what I find is one of the big dangers of theory. Now I'm just going to use a load more for example's sake. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. What a great book. Now, if you like action, if you like a sweeping, moving narrative, don't read this book because it's slow and deliberate. It plods and it's grueling. Because in here you have Helen Huntingdon, our protagonist, and she has done the amazing thing of stepping away from her husband, like walking out on him, and taking their son because she wants to protect her son from his father's influence. He's a reprobate, a dissipate, a drunk, a gambler, a womanizer. He's awful. And yet she still goes back and helps him in his time of need. Now, it would seem, particularly in modernity, our current age, to lend itself very much to a feminist critique. And of course you can critique it feministly, and of course you're going to bring out great insights. But remember, it's a lens, not a crystal ball, into Anne Bronte's mind so that you know explicitly what she's thinking. You can assume things, but you'll never be able to prove them without her. And if you go at it with a lens, you'll never truly be listening to Anne. She tells you what she thinks in here. These are her words. To put them through a lens, you can never, if you're specifically coming at it with a prejudged idea and looking for a particular interpretation, you're not really overly listening to Anne, but you can learn things. So this is often hailed as like a great feminist piece of literature. There's this famous line of her, you know, when she walks out on her husband, it's women, she slams the door for all of womankind on man. I think that's a really feeble interpretation because it tells more about the theorist than it does about the book. You read this book and just go on Anne's words, just go on the story, and you'll find primarily she's concerned about the raising of her son and the bad influence of men on young ones in their education. She spells it out early on that a girl is raised to be good and to avoid vice and not to, you know, dally with men and to keep away from things because they're fragile and all that. So you could talk about, you know, the feminine roles there. But Anne's point is, and women turn up well turned out and relatively nice and well behaved, but boys are told in order to not be a bad man, they should indulge in vice as quickly as possible so that they can get it out of their system, that they should give themselves over to swearing, and it's rather funny. You know, they should do manly things which are a bit obnoxious because then they'll get it out of their system and realise the fault of their ways. And Anne, a governess, through Helen, says boys are being maltreated in their education. Boys need to be given the restraints because they're growing up to turn into Helen's husband. A guy who, because he was indulged as a kid, hasn't broke out of it as an adult. And that's being passed on through all the children. The play's more about looking after young boys in their education than anything. And the consequence of the way you're raised on the outcome of your life. She's a governess. She saw it all the time. And so that's the problem. The lens itself can reveal great things. And there are great essays written on this through various lenses. But Anne's message itself isn't necessarily what the theorists say. And I want you, if you're watching this and you're exploring literature and trying to get deeper into it, not to be put off by theorists and thinking, well, I never saw that. And wow, that's like mystical how they managed to bring all that out. And by the way, really well argued, like the one I mentioned about Great Expectations, some wonderful insights. And overall, in that essay, the author recognised that they're just extracting certain interesting facets through the lens of the Darwinian interpretation. They do overstep the line in a couple of places. I'll mention one. In fact, I'll mention it now. So, using Darwin's theory and the understanding of how hereditary traits are passed on, not knowing about genetics, Mendel, comes very soon after this, but Darwin, in rough terms, he talks about the gemmules, bits of every part of different cell, muscle, bone, everything, descending into the semen so that when it's passed on, all of those traits are... Excuse me, the camera cut out just there. And he talks about the amount of semen, and its relation to what something inherits. In the essay, our author goes, what I think, a little too far and starts to interpret that the amount of money given to Pip was the equivalent of semen in Darwin's theory. You see, this is where I feel you've got too far into your lens. You're starting to get so enamoured with what you're learning, and believe me, great stuff coming out of that essay, really insightful, but then so enamoured, you forget that the book is not about Darwin's theory. And Darwin, when writing it, may have been influenced by that book. In fact, after reading the essay, I'm almost certain he was. But not to a great extent. His story is about humanity, about society, about the things Dickens was always thinking about. And then there's that little overreach. So you can slip out of theory into imposing it from a lens to the crystal ball and saying, now I know what Darwin was thinking. Not Darwin, Dickens was thinking. And this is where you get symbolism drop out of the sky. Where there's probably no symbolism at all. The money is probably just money. So that's an example again. There are other examples. I'll read you a couple of passages, for instance, and then we'll do a funny exercise on Treasure Island through the lens of theory. So let's start with this one. Pride and Prejudice. I'll put the quote on the screen, but let's just read it and see what you could get through the lens of literary theory. From the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners, impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, was such as to form that groundwork of disapprobation on which succeeding events have built so immovable dislike. This is Elizabeth Bennet's famous rejection of Mr. Darcy after he says, you must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you, and then proceeds to, completely diss her family and why she's beneath him. Now, Marxist theory could be used in this to analyse Pride and Prejudice and the struggle between the classes and the class distinctions and the separation and the battle within society in that situation. Okay, maybe you can find elements of that in Pride and Prejudice, but they're not explicitly the point of Pride and Prejudice. If you were using it because you're writing a historic thesis on class struggle and using that as maybe something that Jane Austen brings out in Pride and Prejudice, although she's not aware of it, it's because it's part of her makeup, her experience, we get to see it play out. That's one thing, but to interpret the whole book like that is to completely miss the story. The story is about love, interpersonal relationships, the travails, the assumptions, the pride, the prejudice we all have towards one another, the misinterpretations, the way we imprint our own thoughts on others. All of that is in Pride and Prejudice. That's what Jane Austen's chatting about, not Marxist theory. So use it to extract something, maybe for a greater idea that you're exploring, but never say that's what the book is about. Never reduce a whole book down to that. And great theorists, great writers, don't try and reduce the whole book to that. They know where the limits end. But more and more frequently, it becomes such an exercise in mental titillation that it goes that far, and people begin to think they've seen great insights, which the author certainly hasn't had, especially Jane Austen and Marxism, because Marx came a lot later. So she certainly wasn't thinking about Marx. So do you see that that's one way of doing it, or one problem in doing it? I'll give you another excerpt from Moby Dick, and let's have a look at this one. All visible objects, man, are but as pasteboard masks, but in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there some unknown but still reasoning thing puts forth the mouldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. That's Captain Ahab's meditating on free will and determinism and all that kind of stuff, and the reality of life and the way we experience it. But if you were going through my favourite Freudian psychoanalysis on this, to reduce that statement to inner turmoil, inner conflict, maybe repressed desires and needs, talk about missing the broader view of the human experience and the reality of life and what goes on in us as people. To reduce it just to that psychoanalytical mode, sure, that might bring out some novel idea, but you would completely wreck this book if you were to interpret it entirely through one lens. Remember, a lens is not the image. It's a coloration of the image. It's a warping shape of the image, a zoomed in aspect. It's the difference between an aerofoil on an eagle's wing compared to the biomolecules that make up an eagle's bones. They're both part of the eagle, but they are certainly not the eagle on their own. And that's the danger, I feel, the significant negatives of literary theory is when, because of the fondling of their great intellectual senses, some people reduce great works of literature, whether it's for their own pride of being smarter than everybody else, I don't know, but they reduce great works of literature to complete, mundane, meaningless, dull, tiresome descanting on their own ideologies and trying to convince others. That's the only way to interpret it. Well, the thing is, they are interpreting it. Whereas, if you were to think of a book as an author sitting in the room talking to you, they are telling you what they think. Now, don't you get infuriated when you're trying to reason with someone or share your opinion and they willfully keep interpreting it in a way that pleases them? They're not listening to you. That's where theory can go horribly wrong. But great, remember, great. Don't go away thinking theory is rubbish. It's a great way to analyse aspects and bring novel ideas and intriguing concepts to light, and maybe to put that in a bigger framework of researching something in society or history or humanity. But, make sure it's only being used as a lens, not as a crystal ball. Now, just very quickly, I'll show you this book, Treasure Island. So, off the top of my head, and this will be, very rough, but what could this book turn into? You probably know the story of Treasure Island. It's a typical boy's adventure, and it's written by Robert Louis Stevenson to excite people's minds, to give a sense of adventure and wonder and the desire to just run out of your house and start playing in the garden thinking you're a pirate looking for treasure. That's the point of the book. But if you were to look at it through a theoretical lens, or various theoretical lenses, it's interesting what disasters or absurdities you could come up with. For instance, if I were to look at this through a Marxist lens, what would we have then? It would be the struggle of class between the pirates and the landowners, and how some, because they're not in the place of landowners, they're striving to get some material wealth or betterment is illegal, and only the landowners have the law rigged in their favour to take all of the treasure at the end. And this is all a symbol of class fighting and economic hardships and all that kind of jazz. If you go down that route, what a boring book. What else could we look at this through? Psychoanalytical Freudian. Would turn good old Jim Hawkins into someone who has got an unexpressed desire and is tussling with his inner self, repressing his deepest thoughts and emotions, and his rebellious nature against his mother. Because his father died and his mother overbears and she makes decisions which he doesn't agree with, and so he rebels by striking out to gain the treasure of true expression, which is hidden on some far-off mystical island which he has to travail to get to, and maybe the ship itself stands in for some sexual object. Now, do you see where that's gone totally awry? You could interpret this through a deconstruction lens, where language inherently has no definitive meaning. It's self-contradictory, and so we are all pirates and we are all landowners, and there is a false dichotomy which we put ourselves through to understand our personal existence, and Jim Hawkins fluctuates back and forth between aiming for the ultimate treasure of self-identity, which is elusive. Do you see how you can interpret a simple book for lads, really? And I know I say lads, girls can read it too, but when it was first written, who Stevenson was targeting. You can see how it becomes futile. You could even put that through the feminist lens. The fact that there's, one woman in it, and that's Jim's mum. And she ends up helpless and oppressed by the captain who stays at the house, and how it's only men that can go and gain the treasure. And this is a comment on society and how women are not allowed to reach beyond their position, never to look for any betterment, but simply take their place in society, and the oppressive patriarchy. Do you see? Those are valid things to look for in literature, but not in Treasure Island. And if you come to it with those theories, you're coming to it to interpret it deliberately in one way. That's an imposition of your ideology, rather than just having a bit of fun looking for treasure, and using characters' names who used to work with Blackbeard. Did you know Israel Hands in this was actually the chief gunner on Edward Teach's pirate ship? So Edward Teach being Blackbeard. So there you go. That's my little overview of where I think there are problems, serious disadvantages to literary theory. Do not go away from this thinking, all literary theory is rubbish. That would be wrong. Literary theory gives a framework and a vocabulary for people to talk about certain aspects of humanity, of society, of the individual, of economics, of whatever it may be. And it allows you to investigate. If I wanted to look at the role of people's inner psychologies maybe through time, I could go with, maybe not a Freudian, but with a psychoanalytical lens and look at Pride and Prejudice and see maybe what's coming out through the characters, which may give an insight into the psychology of people at the time, as Jane Austen makes them walk around based on true experience. Remember, no fiction's really ultimately complete fiction. The author always knows people's dispositions of their day, and that's incorporated into a story. So you can, if you are exploring that idea, for instance, you can look at literature. Literature is one of the great artifacts of humanity. It's what cultures produce, and it's produced out of the belief systems, the social constructs of the day. You can reveal things, just like that essay on the Darwinian lens of Great Expectations revealed some interesting ideas of how a major theory could have influenced or begun influencing one of the great writers of the 19th century. But to step that mark and go from saying this is a lens to this is the image, this is exactly what Dickens or Austen meant, that's the error. And that's what puts a lot of people off the more academic comments about literature, is most people can sense that's being pushed too far. And it can put people off literature thinking it's an exercise in hoity-toityism. And it's not. Most books are written by very ordinary people, down to earth, even by the day standards, uneducated people. Shakespeare, greatest playwright ever, in my opinion, never went to university. So what? Wrote the best stuff because he had an instinct for humans. And so when you read, I would suggest, and maybe I'll make a video on this, I'm still formulating my own construct, as it were, like a lens, but hopefully more a window. Which is not theoretical so much, but it's based around the fact that you're having a conversation with the author. Their words are there. They're sharing their thoughts. I'm interested in just hearing what they have to say and whether I agree with them or not. And, can I follow the main thread of their argument or their observation? And I think you can do that. But again, that's not going to be separate from my own experiences, which is part of what reader response theory talks about. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's been edifying for you. Leave your comments down below what you think. And if you want to explore literature more deeply and with a community of people who really love stories, then come and join me on my Patreon. Not only being there will you get exclusive content, we also read a particular classic every month. On top of that, it also supports my channel in being able to keep researching things like this for you and sharing it. And I appreciate your support very, very much. So until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you read.